But thank you for joining us today. My name's Sierra. I'm the Communications Director for Tri-Faith. I also used to work at Urban Abbey, so whether you came here from either organization, welcome, and they're both great organizations. So, and Mike will be facilitating our conversation today, so I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm going to turn it right over to him.
Great. Well, I'm going to try not to take up too much time and leave a lot of room for discussion tonight, too. So hopefully all of you have started to at least start reading the book, and maybe you're caught all the way up through chapter 4. But in advance of the meeting, Sierra sent out a couple of things that are sort of supplemental to what was in the book, and I think are pretty good at kind of providing some additional context to what's on the page. The first thing that Sierra sent out was a video from NPR that kind of traces really a number of the themes that are in The Color of Law to really stitch the whole narrative together and bring it up to the present day. And the second is a website called Mapping Inequality that really is an archive of all of the residential redlining maps, the home ownership loan corporation maps that have been uncovered and sort of researched around the country, and kind of puts those on a map for you to kind of see, what they look like compared to today. And some of the communities, if you explored around the country, some of them even show the demographic breakdowns of the various zones around the country. So today, the first 4 chapters of the book, they start to really kind of start building out the story of, the various policies that really intersected to create a lot of the residential segregation that we have today, with themes about, the Great Migration and, families leaving the South, really trying to avoid really the terrorism of the South in the Jim Crow era, and looking for new opportunities in the North, how that tied with kind of industrialization in the interwar period, kind of between World War I and World War II, and then really kind of even all the industrial growth that led up to and was really experienced in World War II as well. And so we kind of got introduced to the first, the kind of the recurring characters that I mentioned last week, Frank Stevenson in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then Robert Merriday over in Levittown. And so the anecdote that I shared last week about Levittown and some of Robert Merriday's experiences was in the reading for this week as well. I think interestingly though, there was some discussion kind of before the discussion got started about, not really knowing all of these sort of intersecting policies that really created some of what we see today. And I think, there's a lot of things that people have heard of or don't really know about, but I think some of the starkest examples of that from this week are really that the trace of public housing and really the foundation of where public housing started in America, and how it was really for middle-class families who paid the full cost of it. And it was really the government's role was building it, and then it was sold kind of at market rate. There just wasn't enough housing to meet the demand, but how through various sets of policies that actually created many segregated neighborhoods. The public housing was explicitly segregated by the Federal Housing Administration, I guess the Housing Authority, and there were a lot of other federal and local policies that created a lot of residential segregation in places that just didn't simply exist before then. Fast forwarding through to a lot of what we see following World War II with the suburbanization of industry, surely Frank Stevenson's story about the jobs shifting away from some of these racially concentrated areas to more suburban locations, basically created many transportation barriers for families, particularly as it intersected with local zoning policies and how communities used zoning as a tool to explicitly disallow multifamily. And with all of the restrictions in place around mortgage lending, single-family housing really became a race-based policy, and single-family zoning became a race-based policy in this period as well. And so, one thing that we wanted to talk a little bit about, and Jeff is unable to join us this week, he's on vacation. I didn't know you get to take a vacation when you're doing something like this. But one thing we wanted to really talk about was something that we talked about last week, and some of the themes that we think are kind of interesting and good for discussion. And the one that I think is really interesting to kind of dwell on this week is this idea of the American dream and how it's really tied up with home ownership. And as we see in kind of the first 4 chapters of the book, just how many barriers are put in place for Black and brown families in America to reach home ownership. And Jeff and I reached out to Angel Starks, who's a local realtor here. She's joining us on the call today. And I think what I would like to kind of start the conversation with is really one of the things that you all said last week. You wanted to hear from somebody in the real estate industry. It's really just allowing Angel to talk a little bit about her experience, her background, and some of what she sees related to home ownership. And then if there's any questions about this week's reading or things that you think are particularly interesting and you'd like to share with the group, because this is a large group, I'd ask that you drop those in the chat. And after Angel's kind of gone through, I'll try to moderate a little bit of the discussion and call people out to kind of share their thoughts or reflections on either the reading or some of the discussion that we have here tonight. So with that, I'll let Angel kind of dive into a little bit of the discussion about real estate and her experience here in Omaha. And then we'll have a Q&A for the remainder of the time.
Hello, everyone. So I think it's very interesting that they say, here's 10, 15 minutes talk about stuff. And there's so much to talk about. So I'll just give my personal testimony of being a realtor here in Nebraska and just my personal journey of home ownership and so forth. So I'm a native Omahan, born and raised here in Omaha. And as a child, we lived in only apartments. And then when I got to about 7th grade, my mom rented a house. And it was like luxurious because, you know, it was more rooms and we had a basement and, you know, more than one bathroom, which was kind of cool. And but we also knew we couldn't paint the walls, we couldn't hang certain things, we couldn't do things. And you would hear by that time people, my fellow classmates plastering posters all over the walls or whatever the case. And I knew that there were certain things that we just couldn't do, right? And I had no idea about this thing called homeownership. Not until I got into college, actually. I was kind of into the whole Avon, you know, so they would put a sign in your yard if you sold Avon. So Avon sold here or something or another. And I remember driving down the street and seeing a lot of Prudential signs. And I said, wow, all of these people sell insurance. This is amazing. Like they're selling insurance. That's exactly what's happening. But all of the homes were actually for sale. And I didn't understand that the people were selling their homes. And it just clicked like, okay, this is a moment in time that I had no idea that this person was not selling insurance, but they're actually selling a home and possibly getting another one, or someone was buying this home. And this was in college. So in like the early 2000s. And I said, I don't understand what's happening. So the investigator that I am, I looked into it and I realized like, whoa, I could be a person that is selling homes. And I didn't understand that home ownership was just something that you could do and that you had the freedom to be able to own your own home, because it just wasn't my norm. And it wasn't the norm of the individuals that were in my immediate neighborhood. And I just didn't put two and two together. So I took my real estate classes and I was immersed into a field of freedom. Being able to know where your money was, what equity is, your rights, your bundle of rights, who you could go after in order for you to borrow very large heaps of money to put down for something else, but then also what it meant to qualify for said money. And I was just blown away. So that was about 10 years ago, actually, and that I've had my license for almost 10 years. And the person that I am now, I am a team member of Team Locale in Nebraska Realty. The person that I am now regarding real estate is completely different than who I was almost 10 years ago. I started off with a sphere of a lot of people. I just love people, so I knew a lot of people, but the people that I knew actually were not prepared for home ownership by any means. So my first 2 years, I was holding educational classes because they too didn't understand that home ownership was a right that they were given. And they didn't know how to obtain it. They didn't know the education behind it. They didn't understand how loans worked. They didn't understand how to closing costs and all the costs and the ways to qualify for a loan, unless they had lots of money somewhere, which didn't happen. they didn't think that home ownership was something that they could actually obtain. So the first 2 years of my career, it was just hosting first-time homebuyer classes, because I not only wanted my sphere to be at the place where I felt that they should be, but also I needed other people to realize, like, this is a journey. This is something that everybody's owed, and you have to put the work into it to be able to do it. And that was my first instance of seeing how the disparity of individuals that didn't know about homeownership, and that accepting rental life was just the part of it. Now, sometimes renting makes sense, right? If your financial status is a certain way. Within the last couple of years, I've had a lot of clients sell their house and go rent for a couple of years or a year and then get money because it was a great time to sell, right? So they saw it as a business transaction, but there's a population of individuals that see this as their livelihood and the only thing that they can do. So I began to teach financial literacy. And with financial literacy, I taught with junior high, middle school students. And there would be a time that I would show a $75,000 house, and they would say, wow, this house is beautiful. And if you know the market at all, $75,000 house probably needs some work. There's probably some damage, old carpet, but their wow factor. And these students were young women in the Eureka STEM program. They were members of Girls Inc., so predominantly African American or people of color, and that was their. I would love to have this house. This is amazing. And then I would put up a $350,000 house. And they would go, no way that's in Omaha. There's no way that I would be able to get this. There's this. And they're making all of these excuses of why that was never going to be attainable. And that was definitely because there was a sense of mindset that a $75,000 house was as good as it gets. And that's what their immediate surroundings spoke to them, and that was their lived truth, and it wasn't. So then there was not enough individuals around them to show them something different. And so then that's kind of been my appeal of saying I have to be that person that shows the future differently, because not only am I then encouraging a generational poverty mindset, but also what are the steps so that they're not getting caught up, so that prevents them from being able to move forward with that right of having home ownership. And I will find that it is a lot of people of color that are trapped into that. Not to say that it's all and only, but it's trapped into that system of thinking that they will never attain home ownership, when we all kind of figure that that's a part of your own personal wealth, and transfer of wealth for your family is for you to carry on a piece of real estate that usually will increase with equity instead of the opposite. So real estate has been an eye-opener for me. And when I realized how there were individuals that thought that way or didn't think that they could sell real estate, I joined a lot of committees on the Omaha Area Board of Realtors, including the Diversity Committee. And the Diversity Committee actually has a scholarship for minorities that are looking to be into the fields, because, as a real estate agent, one, the test is extremely hard. It's meant to choose the best of the best, okay? And you can take the test 7 times if you want to, but it's not cheap. So why would you continue to do something if you feel like you failed? Because I'm an educator and I'm a learner, I did well on the test, but then I realized I have none of the tools or the experience of being a homeowner. I don't know. I can't relate to someone then that I don't even have myself. So I learned to surround myself with people that are like-minded or above me, so that I can continue to grow in that manner. Not everyone has that awesome skill, but I don't know. I just was blessed with that. With that, I then joined the education committee. So I just immersed myself. So I'm teaching others the exact same things I am being taught at the same time. And of course, they say when one teaches to learn, right? So I am constantly feeding back. And I became the personal spokesperson to say, hey, if you're a person of color or a minority, I would love to have you fill out this application for them to maybe pay your board dues or your classes or whatnot, because it costs a lot of money to get into real estate. And if you already don't have enough money, then how are you going to come up with the money to take the real estate classes to then help educate others on what they could have when it comes to home ownership? But then also not be stigmatized as the scholarship kid. because then that's a whole nother label. And how does that do on you and your personal reputation and professional reputation is, oh, you're only in this field because you're with a scholarship, you got assistance. So that just kind of nicks you all over again. But now I sit on the Omaha Area Board of Realtors as a director, and I was the first Black president for the Women's Council of Realtors of Omaha. And I have just decided that, hey, if someone's going to trailblaze a trail, if someone's going to blaze a trail, then why wouldn't it be me? I have nothing else to lose and I can carry on, you know. But I have learned so much more, and I also love history. So I like defying all odds if possible. And so when I'm given the opportunity to forge forward, that's what I just do. But it hurts me when people see facts or historical context and say, this is what it was intended for us to do. Why aren't they supporting? It's hard for me to accept that, especially since I'm an entrepreneur and I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back to working like a 9-to-5 or something or another. But I see it as a board of directors for the Habitat for Humanity. I see the process it takes for people to have to jump through the hoops and all the exceptions that are required because they don't qualify through the standard process. So if it's something that everybody should have, why is it so freaking hard for people to get it? I actually got my mortgage loan officer's license because I'm a learner, and I decided to practice as a mortgage broker for a year. And after experiencing that, I said, no way, because it made me lose faith in humanity and the systems, because the red tape was so thick that there was no way that I could breathe through the process, or that I could speak to someone and honestly say that there was a future in them getting approved at the particular mortgage company that I was at. I kept having to deny people that were really, if they just had a little bit more education or a little bit more of this, but they didn't. And so then it was just, they completely were wrote off. So it's difficult to live and breathe that when you really want the best for people. So I had to step back and say, hey, if there are individuals making those moves, I want to be the one that see the happiness at the closing table and to make that house a home, so that I can speak and know, because I've been through it and have the knowledge to be able to share. But I can ramble a lot because I love real estate and it's just been my life. So I do much better with questions or anything geared towards the book. So you just let me know.
Sure. Well, and I think it's really interesting. Thank you so much, Angel, for sharing that. And I'm certain that if people have questions about home ownership or some of what you've experienced, feel free to drop those in the chat. And we can absolutely try to get those answered. One thing that I'll pose to kind of the larger group, and anybody can really chime into this. Jonathan has a great, kind of real summary of some of the thesis of the book about de jure segregation and really, the policies that we've created. And some of what he asks is really, this awareness of, not just the issues, but how we got here is a real barrier. And, discussions like this are obviously one way of breaking down some of those barriers. But, what are some ways, as people have been reading the book, how do you think about moving forward? What do you think about some of your opportunities as an individual or organizations that you're a part of as opportunities to move this conversation forward?
I'm going to start by saying that it's often difficult to broach these type of issues because we end up in an echo chamber. And I think that this is a variation of that right now. Not to say that there isn't a diversity of thought around this issue. But what keeps striking me is first how callous, how intentional, and how destructive the law has been in this particular area. And it really speaks directly to who gets to have a part of the American dream. And there's a lot of dream hoarding going on, is what it boils down to. Very intentional, that overtly seeks to limit who can have access to that. And I still think that's a large part of the landscape that we're operating in. I think Angel's testimony is really kind of spot on and kind of highlighting that and detailing who gets to have those advantages, who gets to have those privileges, who gets to have access to wealth, if that's indeed the end game of the American story. I hope that it's not. I hope that we can find other means of being self-actualized. But the book has really bothered me quite a bit. I mean, I knew it in bits and pieces. I'm an academic, so, I've done quite a bit of reading, but I think it's put it in very stark relief to how we're at, where we're at. And so that's why I wanted to pose the question. So how do we move forward from here in a way that isn't just going to be, clipping at the heels of the behemoth that walks by us? How do we do this in a way that just helps to dismantle all of that and really provide more opportunity for people?
I'll answer in short. I feel like education is number one in all things. And the reason why education is so valuable is because if we all start speaking the same language and it continues to go down the line, then people can speak against. That's why there's that new saying, don't be a racist. Don't just not be a racist, be anti-racist, is because people accept the fact or brush it under the rug when someone does something ignorantly, but they don't educate. And that was the moment to educate. So if we're not educating individuals on a consistent basis and not just putting it on the people that are already marginalized, putting it for everybody's voice to continue to educate, then it becomes the norm instead of a burden.
I'm going to push back a little bit as an educator, okay? The reason being is that I also know and have come to a really kind of stunning realization that my institution is sexist and racist from the core. That's why it was established to do the things that it does. That they've allowed women and people of color to be part of the enterprise is a good thing. But if you look at who the leadership is, if you look who the decision makers are, in this institution and almost all the other institutions in America, you end up with the same people making decisions that favor them at the expense of everyone else. And so not that I want to go down this path of being, like overtly socialist or anything like that, but I think there has to be a sense of more shared kind of empathy for others and a more egalitarian sense of who can have these things in their life. I guess the part that angered me most about the book is to know that people who were qualified and had the opportunity back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to become homeowners and to begin to accumulate wealth were overtly denied that through law in this country.
Yeah, I would agree, Jonathan. I think that's one of the more troubling aspects of the book. It's not as though this was people, running, flying in the face of the law. It was really the law as a tool to kind of perpetuate a racial caste system in the country. And while we sort of fast forward to, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, where, discrimination in residential housing decisions is, made illegal, but, unpacking that and thinking, well, where do we stand on day one? The author has a meditation, I think in the epilogue of the book, where he says, what happens on day one after the Fair Housing Act is passed? It's not like a lunch counter where there's instantaneously opportunity. It's not like a school where there's, kids of all races on the doorstep the next day. This is really a generational problem. And I think Angel's, experience about, the barriers that, in families, in communities of just even understanding that pathway and not having people in communities to kind of help carry that forward. It's something that it's going to take a long time to unpack, and it really has to go beyond just a leveling the playing field and not sort of allowing those overt forms of private discrimination. But I would agree that the way that the law was structured, I think, is really deeply troubling. So there's a question here, Jeff. You have a question for Angel. I could read it, but I'll let you ask Angel directly if you'd like.
No. Sorry.
If we're having mic issues, I can go ahead and just read it. But
No, sorry. We're trying to do two of these, and they'll feed back. So we're trying to separate. But you just go ahead and read it.
Sure. Well, Jeff had a question about, Angel, if you've ever experienced, any discrimination or predatory lending practices or encountered any of that, during your time as a lender, or excuse me, as a realtor.
Sure. So it's interesting. An implicit bias is real. And just that undertone of prejudice is real, even though people have really good intentions. But there used to be a time where I sat with all the rest of the agents to kind of learn from them. And the only time that someone would give me a referral just from off the floor was if the house was in North Omaha. Literally, they thought I knew everything about North Omaha. Now, I did not grow up in North Omaha. So I'm just like, how come they are going to give me every referral? Because they just knew that was my connection, right? And I always wanted to ask, are you giving me this referral because I'm Black, but I didn't, that type of thing, because I just kind of made the connection that they felt that I was a North Omaha guru because I'm Black. And there has been several times that it used to be called, or is called, I don't really know, white flight, or blockbusting, when someone sees that a certain person is coming into the neighborhood, all of a sudden all the rest of the homes go up for sale. And you're wondering, how come when my client bought this house, then this house went for sale and this house went for sale? And you will hope for the best and say, though, that's definitely not it. But I'm pretty certain that those are the reasons why it occurred. Just the same, just the limitation on what people are approved for. I think there was also a question about red tape of FHA and VA loans and versus conventional. Right now, we are in such a competitive market that if you have an FHA loan or a VA loan, there's no way that you can compete with the conventional loan. And what's the difference between a conventional loan is that the conventional loan has more cash up front, and you have to have a higher credit score. So all of your finances have to be in such a great order in order for you to be approved for a conventional loan, which if you're a first-time home buyer, or you don't have the best of credit score, or you don't have a lot of cash, FHA is a great way to go because all of the different benefits, especially since it's a government-backed loan or a VA loan at that, but it's also a government-backed loan. So it has government stipulations, and there are home buyers or sellers that will say, I am not going to accept anything other than a conventional or cash. It's amazing that, and I love that people are able to have that amount of cash on hand. But when it comes down to competing with those types of offers, it's a done deal. So sometimes when we have to prepare our clients that say, hey, if you're going to FHA, or if you don't have the opportunity to get gifted money, you're probably not going to get the first or second or third house that we actually try to get, just because of the demands of the market and the, I don't know, it's just the truth of the matter right now that FHA and V are just not, they're just not attractive. And it's usually individuals that need a little bit more assistance that actually qualify for those. And even our NIFA program has increased this credit score stipulations and so forth, just because of the test of times of COVID and the pandemic, and making sure that there's some reliance that people are not going to lose jobs, and that some people are just right. I've had a couple of people get furloughed a week before closing, which has been super tough. But they were service positions, and they figured that service position would not let go, but then it was. And I think those are across the board, everybody and anybody, but there is a huge hit for individuals that are in lower income brackets. And so that stability of housing and the money that they've lost out on takes a huge hit on what they've already done. I am the kind of person that I realize that racism is all around me. And if I were to let it scare me away, I would have never been in the business for this long. So I try not to remember all of those instances of where I felt like I was the only Black person. Well, I am a lot of times only Black person in the room. But I don't know, there's always those microaggressions and so forth that come with it that I didn't realize was something that maybe I should have spoke against, but it just happens because people are unaware. And I think people are more heightened to the effects now than ever. And that's good, I guess. If that answers your question after me rambling, sorry.
No, that was great. Portia in the chat raised a great point about the impact of residential segregation and how it impacts education. Portia, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that thought, but I think that's a great theme that people here in the group probably have, considered as they've been reading the book.
Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm joining the group. I missed it last week. Really, I was just sharing that my pathway to this book is because of my work in education, and specifically early education. And I began to see or ask questions about why are the low performing schools, what? And I have lived in several, at least 5 cities with varying levels of population of Blacks or minorities. And it is the same thing everywhere. There is no difference. Everybody says, well, is that Chicago? No, I'm sorry. You have it here. The same laws and policies that created the South Side of Chicago and the Promised Land, that's another book you could read about, is the same policies that created this. There's no difference. Same way in San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco. It's the same thing. And then after about 4 cities, I said, now, wait a minute, what? And then I started reading about racial stuff. And then I ran into this a better understanding myself as a Black person, what the laws are. How did it come to be? It is no accident. And I used to travel a lot, helping build private public schools in different cities across the country. It's always the same. I can tell you what a city is going to look like that has Black people in it. I don't care if they only got 1,000. I can tell you exactly how the community is going to look. I can tell you exactly what the community is going to say about the schools. I can tell you exactly where they live, and I can tell you how far they live from the interstate. I'll just give me a map, and I'll say, okay, the Black people are right here. It is so. Anyway, but it impacts education because with the segregation comes the disinvestment in Black communities, and it is purposeful and intentional. And because our system is based on property tax and wealth, that's how you get an education now. That's why you guys went through your own educational trauma here a few years ago, that everywhere you go, where there's racial segregation, there's poor school performance. There's a struggle that I have to enter in with the people that are in that community to build up the capacity and opportunity for the children in that community. But don't even get me started on that. But the other thing I was just writing just to say, this is our history. We're talking about the history of America. And why isn't this in the history books? I mean, I've spent a lot of years on my education. And the average person, Black, white, or brown, doesn't know that what we're experiencing now is by design. How come we can't tell that history? So you ask, where do we begin? Well, where we need to begin is the re-education of ourselves and our children. We are to have books that reflect all of the history, not just some of the history, but all of the history. And the younger you could get people's heads wrapped around this and get them to start thinking about stuff like this, the better. Anyway, but that's all I got to say for now. Sorry I talked too long.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you for sharing.
But Portia, that gets in the way of the myth. See, that's where the disconnect happens. You know, all of us have been infused with that myth. We've been socialized to believe all of that stuff. And then when we're confronted with a reality that runs in the opposite direction, 180 degrees, we're either confused or we're angry, and we really don't know what to do. But yet again, that too is by design.
Right.
You know, in the Black community, you have that saying, the okey doke.
Yeah.
That's where it's at.
But I think we got to start somewhere. And but that may be because I'm an educator, and I work with young children, but we've got to correct the history, whether people want to hear it or not. There is a reason why things are the way they are. And we're just going to report the facts. I mean, when I get really frustrated, or my colleagues get really frustrated, my Black, professionals, we've worked very hard. It's very frustrating to try to buy a house. I mean, I actually tell realtors, don't take me to the Black community. I can't talk about that. I'm telling you, I want to be treated as if I'm white. Don't say that, Miss Kimmel. Hello. I have the money. I have the same qualifications. I got the credit rating. I'm just telling you, don't do it. And because if you do, we're not going to make it. It's going to end badly for you. So I'm just putting it out there before we even get, and so you may not want to take me as a client because I'm going to call you on it. I'm going to call you on it. So, I mean, you have to say that because that is the elephant in the room. Nothing is more sensitive than educating children of color and having them in classrooms with other people that represent a cultural and racial and the neighborhood. We don't want to talk about it, but that is it. So as a person that can afford to buy a home and has had a home, the way I've dealt with it is I just deal with it up front. We can't pretend it isn't so, even though they will look at you and say, I can't talk about that. That's not who we are. I said, this isn't about you. I'm talking about the reality of what we live in. I'm just telling you, and let's think about it. And if you prefer not to have these hard conversations or hear this kind of thing from me, I understand. I will find somebody else to work with me.
I love it.
I mean, you got to tell the truth.
That's right.
It's a very sensitive, awful thing in America. Mm-hmm. And nothing brings it up more than if you try to put a Black person in a neighborhood with a good school, or you try to move into a neighborhood with a good school. That brings up very bad things for people of color. Bad things could happen to you. I heard you mention Levittown. I am very, very close, a 30-year friendship with the son of one of the Jewish guys that integrated Levittown. And he passed away, about 2 or 3 years ago, but I met him, and the glass and the whole crazy thing that happened, he wrote a book about it. He and his son wrote a book about it that I have. So that was an example of what can happen. It's dangerous. Dangerous.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Any other thoughts? This is a great discussion. Thank you all for sharing. Any other thoughts on some of these questions about, how we move this discussion forward?
I'd like to.
Sure, go ahead.
I didn't have the video on. I'm sorry.
I'm not sure if that was to me, Mike. I guess I have a brief comment that I think connects. I'm Ben Varnum, and I'm an Episcopal priest out in Elkhorn. And this is maybe a little bit general, but I really do think it connects, which is the Episcopal Church, like many denominations, has been wrestling with our own history of racism and sexism. We have some very nascent efforts that we are, you know, proud of to an inappropriate degree for what they actually do. But one thing that we've seen like a watershed in the last 3 to 5 years is a woman named Helen Svoboda Barber published statistics from the formal authorization of women's ordination to every position in our church, including the episcopacy, the bishops of our church, the diocesan leaders in our church. And she tracked the statistics the way this book tracks the housing data. And that fundamentally changed the conversation. And they started taking pictures of all of the female bishops and just sort of posting them with the length of time it had been, which was sort of, you know, 2 generations of leadership turnover in the church. And so what I guess like bringing the receipts changed that conversation, and they just started tracking how many elections didn't have a female candidate, and they just made it public over and over and over again. And we have seen just a watershed of women elected to our bishop positions in the Episcopal Church. And you know, for my money, that's because they've been qualified and they've been building their resumes longer than their male colleagues have at this point, because men have been, you know, getting sort of undeserved extra attention and you know, over-selected. And so now there's a correction. And so many women who were passed over for a long time are winning elections now and being called to this work that they've trained for and been qualified for a while. And I guess to me, like, it's the same kind of thing that's going on with George Floyd, where there's a video and people can see it, and it breaks down, I mean, to the question of myth, right? If the myth is that the law works, and if the myth is that, you know, this Supreme Court stuff, that it can't be de jure segregation because the Supreme Court's ruled on it, and, you know, and then this book, this author does the research and says, no, here's what de jure means. It means the government wasn't involved in establishing it. Here's where the government established this piece. Here's where the government established this piece. Here's this piece. Here's this piece. Here's, you know, decade by decade, generation by generation. I mean, like, I was convinced in 20 pages. I'm going to read the rest of the book, but like, you know, to the idea that there's no government involvement is just gone immediately when you actually track it out. So I'm with Portia. I believe in education, and I also do think, I mean, I think with George Floyd, there's a lot of people, to quote a friend of mine who's a pastor in Chicago, there's a lot of people waking up and saying, like, where have I been and where do I need to be now so this stops happening? And you know, as Jonathan was saying, I think people have reactions and they have confusion, but I also think, like, showing the receipts changes people. It disrupts the myth, and people, at least, like, at that point, they're willing to say, like, well, what other roadmaps could there be? And even if we don't have one, having people who are open to that question, and especially people who are part of that, and I sort of count myself and the white church here, but people who are part of just the inertia of, well, it must be working because it exists. Like, when you get that mindset disrupted, people start being open to different kinds of conversations. So, you know, I think that's the deconstructive, the disruptive piece. I don't know, I don't have the roadmap forward, but, you know, for me, it means showing up at more conversations like this one right now.
Great, thank you, Ben. Carrie asked a question about, you know, legislation and if there's any local legislators involved in this conversation. I'm not plugged into that scene as much as many of you might be, but I do know that Senator Justin Wayne from North Omaha had offered some bills around, some things around affordable housing and housing policy in the last couple of sessions, but there might be others in this group who are more plugged into those conversations. Feel free to share if you are.
Yeah, you know, I'm a political scientist, and I really applaud the effort by Senator Wayne to advance some new thinking around these particular issues. But what strikes me here because he's the lone voice in the ocean, calling out for change. And there really does need to be more allyship on the part of some other elected officials, because at the end of the day, and maybe Angel will attest to this, in the real estate market, the rising tide does lift all boats. And we need to be considerate of that if we're going to be able to do this. And so until such time as he's getting support from elected officials that do not live in North Omaha and have a vested interest in the larger well-being of the community, I think it's going to be almost a fruitless effort. Not to say that he shouldn't be doing it, because he's right to introduce the legislation, but I'm just a little still dismayed that he's not receiving the requisite support to make this become law. He may be able to persuade some, but I need to see more vocal support. And this is what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement. We're seeing more intentional vocal support on the part of allies. That has to happen in this arena too. But this is the third rail in American society. Don't mess with other people's money. And so how do we do that in a meaningful manner that's not going to scare people away to think we're a bunch of whack jobs trying to, steal their cheese or something like that? We have to be a lot more attentive to how we can engage people in a meaningful conversation to see that ultimately they will benefit from it.
Well, Jonathan, that's a great point. And thank you, Mike, for bringing up the question, and Jonathan for adding that in. It makes me think, reaching out to my legislators in my area to say, I understand this senator is working on this issue. How can we get involved and help protect him? Because I worked in a lot of advocacy in the state of Kentucky, and good old boy network. But I worked on raising funds for an arts program that was state funded for kids all across the state of Kentucky. And it, those voices, it doesn't take that many voices to start to get people to jump on. Like, I know that one of the hardest things was teaching people, they'd be like, what's the point? No one's going to listen anyway. It probably takes 1,000 voices. We don't have that many. And one time I asked a legislator, I said, how many people have to call before you go, this issue matters? And he said 6 phone calls, and now it matters. So it just makes me think, like, reaching out to my legislators to say, where do you stand with the work that Senator Wayne is bringing up in front of the legislature? But also that leads back into the school as well. OPS had their board meeting last night. Of course, COVID is front and central. But where are those curriculum committees? And do those curriculum committees allow non-board members and members of the community? I grew up in Omaha, but I moved away and I just came back solid in this January. So, voices are strong. And I think finding out where we can plant ourselves so that when policy or when curriculum's being chosen are one of the things, and I'm not sure, but I would like to think that these books that we're even talking about are being considered for the curriculum, right? And then those books written more for per grade level as well across the spectrum. And I don't know the answers to those questions, but if anybody else has also an idea of how can we get more invested in making our voice heard when it comes to choosing that curriculum, and what are the students going to be what will students be educated about this year? Because, and it's tricky too, it just brings it back around to what blew my mind about the book is, yes, the policies, laws were put in place to segregate. And then on top of that, when there was any room inside a law that might leave room for desegregation, that there were loopholes that people were constantly looking for. It was like the policy was one thing, but tweaking that policy, and it comes right down to wordsmithing, can knock out an entire movement to try and reverse it. And then saying, once it is established, it's really hard to turn it around, but it's not impossible, and it's going to take a lot of work. But those are just the thoughts going through my head in looking at how do we take action.
I think it's really interesting that when you think about policy and legislation, that it's the drumbeat all the time is property tax relief, property tax relief, property tax relief. And who does that benefit? I mean, that we're just there, the obsession with it. And I'm not, saying it's right or wrong in terms of whether or not the formula is right and, whatever and so forth. But, if you look at in terms of policies that's going to help home buyers and homeowners the obsession with the property tax thing on the legislative level is going to disproportionately impact the wealthier Nebraskans. And somehow that seems to me to be the hang up.
Excellent. Yeah, and those points, these points around education and who benefits from these policies are really where the book ends up in those final chapters. And this thought process around, what's in our textbooks, the author actually looks at, I think, the top 2 or 3 textbooks that are used for like high school social studies, high school government and history. And one of them has, I think, one passive voice passage about how African Americans were segregated into neighborhoods in urban areas, and no explanation, no expounding, no sort of a detail or sort of really thought process about how that connects to slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation and Jim Crow and the Great Migration. No real thread through of how all these issues are intertwined and how they've really shaped the communities that children are growing up in and living in today. And so I think those are great points, excellent thoughts on all of this. We have about maybe time for one more question or reflection before we wrap up here. Otherwise, I'm happy to kind of put a bow on it for this week and kind of talk a little bit about where we're going to be going in kind of the next week's discussion. Okay, well, I think this has been great discussion. I'm really excited about all of you being willing to share your thoughts. So next week, we're looking at chapters 5 through 8. So kind of got through chapter 4 this week. If you're on the reading plan with us, chapters 5 through 8, really kind of take an even deeper look at some of these other programs. We get into this period that some of you might be familiar with these notions of urban renewal. Portia's thoughts about meditating on this idea of freeways and how they intersect with redlining and all of these other issues. That's going to be a piece that we're going to cover here. And then also this notion of local tactics, how what I think is one of the most interesting chapters of the whole book, and really how groups of all kinds, including neighborhood associations, private civic benefit associations, and churches, really had a hand in kind of privately enforcing a lot of these notions of residential segregation throughout the country as well. And so this is also an area where Jeff and I, we have some visuals that we've put together to kind of explore some of how our own community has been shaped by these policies of urban renewal and freeways, and really how it ties back to some of these periods here. So we'll send those over to Sierra to share with the group. But we've got some kind of interesting maps with sliders that you'll be able to kind of explore the Omaha community and see, through aerials and through the redlining map in our community, just how things really have been transformed in the last 60 to 70 years. And so we're excited to share that, and hopefully it'll be something that that can really, help us think a little bit more about where we are today as a community and some of the issues that we want to stand up and really help kind of lead discussions about in our community. But finally, Angel, thank you so much for sharing, and on such short notice. We only contacted you in the last week, and so thank you to Angel for being willing to share. We know that that real estate was one of these interests that you wanted to hear from. One person that we have lined up for next week is Earl Redrick, who is a representative of Housing and Urban Development. And so he's a partner that Jeff and I have worked with quite a bit through the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing work here in Omaha. He's got a tremendous amount of experience here in Omaha, and I think he's going to be a real great person to really help and aid in this discussion about the federal role in all of this. Kind of this urban renewal piece is a great point of being able to kind of think about federal agencies and how that connects to the policies that we're seeing today. And so we're real excited that Earl's available. One other thing I wanted to mention is that another group that we talked about, the Union for Contemporary Art, on Facebook, they have a Undesign the Red Line virtual tour that they're doing, I believe on the 28th of July. So we're not sure if Brigitte or anyone on her team is going to be available to participate in this group, but if they're not, you know, we will send out the details of that event as well, because I think it's a great opportunity to, again, kind of connect with these issues locally and really kind of be able to think about how the content of the book really connects with the community that we all live in as well. So any questions before we end tonight's discussion? Otherwise, thank you all for your attentiveness, and feel free to reach out during the week if you have any other questions.
Thank you so much. I'll send an email tomorrow and then again next week. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.